The attack came without warning. On the outer rim of the galaxy, a small human colony on the planet Verix had always been overlooked by the major galactic powers. It was a quiet place, inhabited by farmers, miners, and families hoping to make a life in the stars. The Joreth didn't even consider it a worthy target. Until now. In a sudden, overwhelming strike, the Joreth descended upon Verix like a storm, their ships blackening the sky and their ground forces cutting through the colony with ruthless efficiency. At the heart of the chaos stood Captain Elijah Carter, a seasoned veteran who had fought in countless battles. She was no stranger to conflict, but this was different. This was no mere skirmish. It was the start of something far bigger. The Joreth, with their enormous warships and terrifying technology, had finally set their sights on humanity. As the Joreth forces landed, the colony's defense systems were overwhelmed in minutes, but Carter and her team weren't going down without a fight. Their orders were clear: hold the line, buy as much time as possible for civilians to evacuate, and fight for every inch of ground. The humans, despite being outgunned and outnumbered, had something the Joreth lacked: determination. Elijah Carter's eyes were sharp as she surveyed the battlefield. The Joreth were towering, their armor gleaming black with spikes, each step shaking the ground beneath them. They wielded energy weapons capable of leveling entire cities with a single blast. But Carter wasn't fazed. She had seen worse. Get to the south wall, she shouted to her troops, voice cutting through the chaos. Set up the turrets. We hold them there. Her soldiers, armed with whatever they could get their hands on, scrambled into position. They were outgunned, yes, but not outsmarted. Carter had fought in the trenches before. She knew how to use the environment, how to make every shot count. As the Joreth charged, Carter's team began to fight back. It wasn't a fight for victory. It was a fight to survive. But the humans had one advantage. They were unpredictable. The Joreth were used to subjugating civilizations that followed traditional patterns, civilizations that would crumble when faced with overwhelming force. But humanity wasn't like the others. Carter's team used every available structure as cover, setting traps, ambushing Joreth troops as they moved. Human ingenuity and quick thinking turned the battlefield into a deadly game of cat and mouse. Explosions rang out, and Joreth war machines were torn apart by well-placed shots. A human sniper, hidden on a rooftop, took down a Joreth commander, and the rest of the soldiers hesitated, just long enough for another ambush. It wasn't much, but it was enough to slow the Joreth down. The ground was littered with debris, and smoke filled the air. In the chaos, Carter found herself face to face with a Joreth warrior, its massive form charging at her with a terrifying roar. Without hesitation, she reached for the blaster at her side and fired. The blast sent the creature reeling back, but it wasn't enough to kill it. The warrior surged forward, slashing with its serrated blade. Carter ducked and rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the strike. She pulled a grenade from her belt, tossed it at the creature's feet, and dove for cover. The explosion rocked the battlefield, and when the dust cleared, the Joreth warrior was down, its armor shredded. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Carter knew the fight wasn't over. The Joreth would regroup, and this battle would soon be forgotten in the larger war that was coming. But for the first time, humanity had struck back, showing the Joreth that they were not to be underestimated. The battle for Verix was far from won, but the spark had been lit. Humanity had finally made its mark, and the Joreth would learn that underestimating humanity was a mistake they would never forget. In the months that followed the battle for Verix, humanity found itself caught in a war that would span the stars. The Joreth, enraged by the unexpected resistance, launched a brutal counteroffensive. Entire fleets of Joreth warships appeared from the depths of space, and countless human colonies fell before their unstoppable assault. The Joreth didn't fight with the care of conquerors. They fought to annihilate, to wipe humanity off the map. But the humans, though vastly outnumbered, refused to go quietly. Captain Elijah Carter, now a symbol of human defiance, was called upon to lead humanity's fractured resistance. She was no longer just a soldier. She was a beacon of hope in a galaxy drowning in despair. She had seen enough to know that the Xoreth weren't interested in peace. They had only one goal: total domination. The only way to survive was to fight back with everything humanity had, even if it meant endless sacrifice. At first, humanity's victories had been hard-won, fueled by surprise and clever tactics. But as the war dragged on, it became clear that it was not enough to merely resist. The Xoreth were relentless. Every time humanity scored a victory, the Xoreth struck back with twice the fury. Their fleets seemed endless, and their forces were vast beyond comprehension. But humanity was adapting, becoming more efficient in their defense. Elysia and her commanders realized that their previous tactics, guerrilla strikes, sabotage missions, ambushes, weren't going to cut it anymore. The Xoreth had begun to adjust, and soon their tactics shifted. They no longer underestimated humanity, and their warships arrived in even greater numbers. The resistance had to evolve to keep up. A meeting was called in a secret bunker on the human stronghold of Archon Prime. The brightest minds and the most experienced warriors gathered to discuss a new plan of attack. The room was filled with a sense of urgency, the weight of their dwindling resources heavy on their shoulders. Elysia stood at the head of the table, scanning the faces of those around her. "We need a new strategy," she said firmly. "We can't keep playing defense. If we don't start going on the offensive, we'll be wiped out before we can even make a dent in their forces." One of her top strategists, Colonel Samuel Riker, spoke up. "We've seen their weaknesses, Elysia. They're powerful, yes, but their command structure is overly rigid. We've taken down their commanders before. If we target their fleet leaders, disrupt their communication networks, we might be able to throw them off balance." Elysia nodded. "Agreed. We've managed to hit them before. We'll keep hitting them. Only this time, we hit harder and faster. This won't be a war of attrition. We need to cripple them before they can strike back." The plan was set into motion, and humanity's resistance began to grow bolder. Their fleet, though smaller, was growing stronger. More allies, alien species sympathetic to humanity's cause, joined in their struggle, forming a loose alliance against the common enemy. The fight had turned into a galactic war, and humanity was determined to show that they weren't the fragile, weak species the Xoreth thought they were. As Carter's forces took to the stars, their first major offensive operation took place on the moon of Solara, a barren world that was a key Xoreth military base. The battle was brutal, a true test of human will against the Xoreth's overwhelming power. But through ingenuity and sheer grit, the humans struck first, hitting the Xoreth's supply lines and communication hubs. It was a victory, though small. The humans had forced the Xoreth to retreat, but only temporarily. For every success, the Xoreth retaliated with unmatched fury. Yet humanity didn't relent. They learned, adapted, and kept fighting. The resistance wasn't perfect, but it was persistent. Humanity had proven that it wasn't afraid to bleed for its survival. And even when the odds seemed impossible, the humans refused to give up. They would fight, no matter how long it took or how many battles they had to face. The Xoreth, once confident in their domination, now had to reconsider. This was no longer a war to conquer a weak species. Humanity had become something far more dangerous, an eternal enemy that would never cease. The war had now been raging for over a decade. What had started as a desperate struggle for survival had become an all-consuming fight for the future of humanity. The Xoreth, despite their advanced technology and seemingly endless forces, had never been able to fully crush the human spirit. It wasn't that humanity's armies were larger, stronger, or better equipped. It was that they would never stop fighting. No matter how many times they were knocked down, they always got back up. Captain Elysia Carter had become a symbol of that resilience. Her name was whispered across the galaxy, spoken with reverence and fear in the same breath. To the Xoreth, she was a constant thorn in their side, a reminder that their seemingly unstoppable forces could be challenged. But to humanity, she was something more. She was a legend, the embodiment of their will to survive. Yet even the strongest leaders are tested by time. As the years dragged on, Elysia found herself haunted by the weight of it all. The battles were unending, and the cost was mounting. The faces of those who had fought and fallen, the friends she had lost along the way, were burned into her memory. She was no longer the young, eager officer who had led the charge on Verix. The war had changed her, as it had changed everyone. The lines between hero and survivor were starting to blur. She had seen the toll the endless conflict had taken on her soldiers. The scars were no longer just physical. For every victory, there was a loss. For every Zorath commander they killed, another one took their place. For every world they freed from the Zorath's grip, 2 more fell to the invaders. The endless cycle was suffocating, and the question that haunted Elysia most was, would it ever end? It wasn't just the soldiers who were feeling the weight of the war. Entire generations had been born into conflict, raised to believe that fighting was all there was. Young recruits arrived at the front lines every day, ready to take up the cause. But they had never known peace. They were children of war, raised by parents who had lived through it, and taught them that survival meant never giving up. Among these recruits was Lieutenant Cal Hartley, a young officer who had idolized Elysia since the first battle he had ever heard about her. He had been a child when the war began, but he had grown up hearing stories of the captain's brilliance in battle. To him, Elysia represented hope, the very idea that one day humanity could defeat the Zorath and live without fear. But now, as he served under her command, Cale was starting to see the cracks in the facade. He saw how the unrelenting nature of the war was wearing Elysia down, how her once unwavering confidence now faltered at times. The burden of leadership weighed on her shoulders, and she carried it alone. The idea of an end, of peace, was a distant dream. Cale wasn't sure if it was something even Elysia truly believed in anymore. One night, during a rare moment of rest on the war-torn planet of Zorathis, Cale approached her. They sat together in the dim light of a command tent, surrounded by maps and reports of the latest battles. "You've been at this for so long," Cale said softly, unsure if she would even respond. "Do you ever wonder if it's worth it?" Elysia turned to him, her eyes tired but steady. "Every day," she said quietly. "But we don't get to choose the battles we fight, Cale. We just fight them. There are too many lives at stake for me to walk away now." Cale nodded, understanding more than she knew. He had never known anything but this war, and neither had she. The war had become their entire existence. For the soldiers under her command, Elysia was more than just a leader. She was a lifeline. Without her, many wondered if they would have even survived this long. She had become a symbol of endurance, a hero to humanity's fractured hope. But even heroes have their limits. The war, though fought valiantly, was beginning to feel like a weight they could never escape. For every victory they claimed, the cycle seemed to begin anew, with no end in sight. And yet, amidst the darkness, humanity's heroes rose. Elysia Carter, Cale Hartley, and countless others, each of them struggling to find meaning in a war that seemed as if it would never cease. Their names would be remembered, etched in history, and perhaps someday they would inspire the generations that would fight for peace in the stars. But as for Elysia, she couldn't shake the feeling that the battle she faced wasn't just with the Zorath. It was with the very concept of time itself. The war would never end, and neither would her duty. The discovery of immortality was not the triumph humanity had hoped it would be. It came in the form of a breakthrough from a forgotten human research project, one buried deep in the archives of an old, abandoned laboratory on the planet Nexa. After years of desperation and mounting losses, the last hope for ending the war rested on a seemingly impossible idea: the ability to transcend time itself. The research team had long been dismissed as dreamers, working on a theory that seemed as far-fetched as the possibility of achieving peace in the middle of the unrelenting war. But when the team uncovered the Zorath's own studies into biological preservation, they realized something extraordinary. The Zorath, too, had experimented with immortality. It was not just for the sake of survival. It was a tool of conquest. But for humanity, it could be the key to winning the war. The process was delicate. It involved manipulating the human genome to prevent cellular degeneration, stopping the aging process and allowing the body to regenerate at a rate that would keep it in peak condition indefinitely. The first test subjects were volunteers, soldiers who had already seen their comrades fall in battle, those who had little left to lose. Captain Elijah Carter, though initially hesitant, was one of the first to undergo the procedure. She had become a symbol of humanity's resistance, a face known across the galaxy as the embodiment of hope. And as the war dragged on, she realized that, despite every victory, she could never escape the brutal cycle of conflict. To defeat the Joreth, to truly secure a future for humanity, they needed more than bravery. They needed endurance, and immortality was their answer. The procedure was brutal. The changes to the human body were significant, and there was no guarantee that it would work. But when Elijah awoke after the process was complete, she was different. Her wounds healed within minutes, her body perfectly preserved as if she were still in the prime of her youth. Her mind, however, was a different story. At first, she felt an overwhelming sense of power. The idea of living forever, of never growing old, was intoxicating. She thought of all the battles she could fight, all the people she could save. For a moment, it seemed like a dream come true. But as weeks turned into months, and then years, the initial thrill of immortality began to wear off. Elijah found herself haunted by something more profound than the relentless cycle of war. She was changing in ways she hadn't expected. She became more distant, less able to connect with those around her. The faces of the soldiers who fought beside her, now long gone, seemed to blur into a haze. The endless battles began to lose their meaning. What was the point of fighting when it felt like the fight would never end? The worst part was the realization that she had no way of knowing how long this would go on. Would she be fighting for centuries? Millennia? The idea of living forever no longer seemed like a gift. It felt like a curse, an endless cycle of pain and loss with no escape. The other immortals were experiencing the same thing. At first, they had all been enthusiastic about the transformation, convinced that this was the key to defeating the Joreth and ending the war. But as they continued to live, their bonds with humanity, with each other, began to fray. The immortal soldiers became colder, more mechanical in their actions. They no longer fought for the sake of survival. They fought because that was all they knew how to do. And as time stretched on, they began to wonder, would they ever be free? Could there be an end to this war if they never grew old, never died? The Joreth, for their part, watched the humans' transformation with growing interest. The immortality process hadn't gone unnoticed, and soon they began to suspect that this new ability could be humanity's secret weapon. The Joreth were not unfamiliar with the idea of immortality, but seeing it so vividly in human warriors was both intriguing and terrifying. Humanity had unknowingly entered a new phase of the war, one in which they were no longer fighting just to survive. They were now fighting to break the very cycle that had ensnared them. But as the immortals took to the front lines, they could not escape the haunting question. Was immortality truly a gift, or had they simply become prisoners of time? The immortality granted to the soldiers of humanity had begun to change everything, but not in the way they had hoped. The initial promise of an endless supply of warriors capable of fighting the Joreth without the burden of aging had shifted into something darker, something that no one could have predicted. Captain Elijah Carter, now centuries removed from the day she first became immortal, had seen countless battles won and lost. Her body was still as strong as it had been in her prime, but her mind, her heart, was beginning to crack. She had watched friends, comrades, and allies grow old and pass away, and though she remained unchanged, the grief of their loss gnawed at her. Over time, the faces of those she had loved blurred. It wasn't just the soldiers, either. Entire generations of humans had come and gone, while she stood still, unable to keep up with the ever-changing world. The weight of immortality was a burden far heavier than any of them had anticipated. It wasn't just the physical strain of watching time pass. It was the emotional toll. The immortal soldiers found themselves losing touch with their humanity, slipping further away from the very people they'd fought to protect. The faces of the next generation of soldiers didn't resonate the same way, as they had never known a time when humanity wasn't locked in this eternal conflict. There was no peace to dream of, no life beyond the war. It was all they knew. Elysia was not the only one feeling the crushing effect of immortality. Lieutenant Cale Hartley, once a hopeful young officer who had believed in the possibility of peace, now found himself doubting everything. The years dragged on, and the Immortals became increasingly distant from their fellow humans. While they were living forever, they were also living in a constant state of war, of conflict. They had lost the ability to truly live, to find joy or purpose outside of the endless battle. Is it worth it? Cale found himself asking, looking over the horizon of the war-torn planet they had been stationed on. His voice was quiet, filled with the weight of the question he had been carrying for years. Elysia, standing beside him, didn't need to ask what he meant. She understood. They had all asked the same question. She had fought to give humanity a chance at survival, to protect the future. But now, with each passing century, she wondered if she had become part of the problem. If immortality had been the price for victory, was it even worth it? "I don't know, Cale," she said finally, her voice soft with the weight of her own uncertainty. "When we first became immortals, we thought we were saving humanity. We thought we could end this war for good. But the longer we fight, the less certain I am that there will ever be an end to it." Cale sighed, the lines of exhaustion on his face becoming more pronounced. "I used to believe in the cause, believe that if we just kept fighting, kept winning, there would be an end. But now, it feels like we're just going in circles. The Joreth keep coming, and we keep pushing them back. But there's no final victory, no last battle. It's just endless." The thought echoed in Elysia's mind. Endless. The war would never stop, not while immortality kept them alive. Even if humanity defeated the Joreth, what would be left? What kind of life would there be if they could never escape the cycle of combat? It was a question that haunted her every day. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, the Joreth had noticed the shift in the humans. The immortality had given them new strength, yes, but it had also made them unpredictable. The Joreth, who once thought they could easily crush humanity, now found themselves facing an enemy that refused to break, an enemy that would never surrender, no matter how long the war dragged on. The Joreth, who had initially been drawn to conquer, were now intrigued. They had underestimated humanity's resolve and had been taken aback by the Immortals who walked among the human forces. The Joreth feared that this new development might actually give humanity a fighting chance, something they had never considered possible. But as the war continued, it became clear that this was a fight for more than just domination. It was a fight for survival on both sides, a fight against time itself. And in the heart of it all, Elysia realized something crucial. The war was never just about defeating the Joreth. It was about breaking free from the endless cycle, from the weight of immortality and the constant war. It was about finding the meaning in a life that seemed to have no end. The endless war and the weight of immortality had fractured humanity's spirit. The soldiers who had once fought with fire and passion now felt like ghosts, walking through a world where time was both a gift and a curse. Captain Elysia Carter, along with her immortal comrades, had come to a devastating realization. This war would never end unless they found a way to break the cycle. But how could they end a war that had gone on for centuries, with no clear beginning or end in sight? For years, the Immortals had fought in the trenches, their faces growing ever more distant from the world they had once known. They had become detached from the very people they fought to protect. And though their bodies remained strong, their spirits had begun to crumble. The thought of eternity in an endless war was no longer something they could bear. Elysia spent long hours staring out into the blackness of space, trying to find a way forward, trying to hold on to the ideals she had once believed in. She had led humanity through countless battles. But now, she was uncertain whether it was worth continuing. The war was no longer about survival. It was about breaking free from the chains of immortality, from the endless cycle of death and rebirth on the battlefield. In a rare moment of clarity, Alicia called together her most trusted allies, Lieutenant Cale Hartley, Colonel Samuel Riker, and Dr. Nix Voss, the scientist who had been responsible for the immortality process. They gathered in the war room, a dimly lit space filled with maps, charts, and projections of the galaxy's shifting front lines. It was a place where strategies were devised and decisions were made. But tonight, the conversation would be different. This was no longer about tactics or victories. It was about finding a way to escape the war that had consumed them all. "We need to find a way to break the cycle," Alicia began, her voice heavy with the burden of centuries. "The Zoreth, the immortality, this war, none of it is sustainable. We can't keep going like this. We've lost too much." Cal's eyes were tired, his face a mask of exhaustion. "What are we supposed to do, Alicia? The Zoreth aren't just going to give up. And as long as we have immortality, we'll never be able to stop fighting." "We don't just need to fight the Zoreth," Alicia said, her voice firm with resolve. "We need to break the system. The Zoreth thrive on conquest and control, but they don't understand what immortality has done to us. We're no longer the same species. We've been transformed, physically and mentally. And we can't keep pretending that we can fix this with more violence." Dr. Nix Voss spoke up, her voice tinged with frustration. "I agree with you, Captain. But the immortality process was never meant to be a weapon. It was a survival measure. And yes, it's changed us. But it wasn't designed to trap us. I've been working on a solution, but it's risky. It's not something we can implement on a large scale." "Risky is better than nothing," Cale said, his eyes narrowing. "We need something, anything, to get us out of this nightmare." Dr. Voss hesitated before speaking again. "I've developed a countermeasure, a way to reverse the immortality process. It won't bring back the people we've lost, but it might allow us to regain our humanity. If we can find a way to turn back the clock for even a few of us, we might stand a chance of ending this war on our terms." Alicia stared at the scientist, her heart beating faster. "You mean we could give up immortality? We could stop fighting forever?" "It's not that simple," Dr. Voss said. "Reversing immortality won't erase the damage that's been done. The physical and emotional toll of living so long without purpose has already taken its toll. But it could give us the chance to start over, maybe even end the war once and for all." Alicia stood in silence, the weight of the decision settling heavily on her shoulders. She had spent centuries fighting, watching humanity tear itself apart in an endless struggle. But now, for the first time in a long while, there was a glimmer of hope that the war could end not through more fighting, but by reclaiming the very thing that made them human, their mortality. "We'll need to talk to the others," Alicia said quietly, her gaze lingering on each of her allies. "If we're going to do this, we can't do it alone. We need to convince the Immortals that it's time to let go of this endless war." Cale nodded, though a hint of doubt remained in his eyes. "And what happens if we fail?" Alicia turned toward the stars, her mind heavy with the possibilities. "Then we'll know we tried. And maybe that's enough." The days following the meeting in the war room were filled with tension and uncertainty. Alicia had never imagined a time when she would even consider giving up immortality, let alone try to convince others to do the same. For centuries, the Immortals had fought because they believed they were humanity's best chance for survival. They had believed that eternal life would grant them the time to win the war, to secure a future for the generations to come. But now, the very thing that had made them eternal was also the thing that kept them trapped. Alicia spent the next few days traveling across the war-torn planets, meeting with the Immortals who had fought alongside her. Each conversation was harder than the last. She could see it in their eyes. The exhaustion, the apathy, the sense that they were no longer sure of why they fought. But even so, the idea of reversing their immortality was something most of them could not comprehend. For them, the thought of losing their strength, their endless endurance, was as terrifying as it was unimaginable. Lieutenant Cale Hartley, though still haunted by the unending cycle of war, struggled with the idea of giving up the one thing that had kept him alive. He had seen friends die over and over again, only to be replaced by new faces. His body had remained young, but his mind had grown old. The thought of becoming mortal again, of experiencing the inevitable decay of age, was a terrifying prospect. What would it mean for him, and for the others, to go back to the way things once were? But as Elysia visited the immortal soldiers, one by one, she began to understand the true cost of their eternity. It wasn't just about physical immortality. It was about losing their connection to life itself. Time had stretched on so long that they had become strangers to the world they were trying to save. They were warriors, yes, but they were also prisoners. The war had become their purpose, their reason for existence. Without it, they didn't know who they were anymore. Elysia, Cale said one evening as they sat together on the balcony of a command post overlooking the battlefield, what if reversing it doesn't fix anything? What if the war continues and we just become mortal men, doomed to die in it, like the rest? Elysia sighed, her eyes fixed on the horizon. I don't know, Cale. I don't know what will happen. But I do know this. We can't keep going on like this. We can't keep fighting forever. And we can't keep losing ourselves in this endless war. We've already lost so much. Cale was silent for a long time. He understood the weight of what she was saying. The immortality that had once been their salvation was now their prison. But could he let go of it? Could he face the unknown, the inevitable end that awaited them as mortals? The next day, Elysia and Cale stood in front of a gathering of immortals, all of them silently watching the two of them, waiting for something, some sign that the endless war could finally be over. The decision had been made, and now they had to face the consequences. I know you've all fought for so long, just like I have, Elysia began, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. We've given everything to this war, believing that it was our purpose. But now, I'm asking you to consider something different. We have the chance to reverse this, to give up immortality. It's not an easy decision, but we cannot be the guardians of humanity if we've lost what makes us human. The time has come to end this war, not by continuing to fight, but by finding a new way. Cale spoke next, his voice rough but filled with conviction. We've fought for so long, but if we continue down this path, we'll lose everything. Our immortality may have kept us alive, but it's also kept us trapped. It's time to face the reality of what we've become. There was a long silence as the immortals exchanged glances. Some were silent, hesitant, while others seemed to reflect on the gravity of the decision. Slowly, one by one, the immortals stood and nodded in agreement. It wasn't easy. It wasn't something they could accept immediately. But they understood that it was the only way to break free. And so, the decision was made. Dr. Nix Voss began preparing the reversal process, the complex procedure that would strip the immortality from the soldiers and return them to their natural mortal state. It would be a painful process, one that would take everything they had left, but it was the only way to free them from the curse they had become. As the first immortals underwent the reversal, the battlefield felt quieter, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. For the first time in centuries, Elysia allowed herself to hope. The war was not over yet, but this was the first step toward a future where humanity could live, truly live, without the endless conflict. But as they faced the unknown, one truth became clear. There was no going back. The choice had been made. And no matter the cost, they would see it through to the end. The reversal process was long and agonizing. For the immortals who had spent centuries on the front lines, it was a painful reminder of the passage of time they had never fully experienced. The procedure developed by Dr. Nix Voss was designed to return them to their original human form. It was a delicate operation that required every ounce of focus and care, but the Immortals went through it without hesitation, understanding that this was their last chance to reclaim the life they had lost. As each Immortal underwent the reversal, there was an undeniable sense of change in the air. The battlefield, which had once been filled with the sounds of endless fighting, seemed quieter. The rumble of war still echoed in the distance, but it was no longer the defining force of their existence. The Immortals were becoming mortal again, and that meant the war, too, had to change. Elysia was one of the last to undergo the reversal. She stood before Dr. Voss, her mind full of conflicting thoughts. Part of her was terrified. What if she couldn't handle being human again? What if the loss of immortality was more than she could bear? But another part of her felt relief. For the first time in centuries, she felt the weight of the decision settle in her chest, and the anticipation of what life could be like without the endless cycle of war. She had led humanity through so much, but now it was time to step back and live as she had once dreamed. "I'm ready," she said to Dr. Voss, her voice steady but tinged with the vulnerability of someone taking a leap into the unknown. Dr. Voss nodded solemnly. "This will be difficult, Captain, but it's the only way forward. We're not just undoing immortality. We're reclaiming what it means to live." Elysia closed her eyes as the procedure began. It was excruciating. Her body seemed to unravel and rebuild itself simultaneously, the very essence of her being shifting back to what it had been before the immortality process. The transformation was intense, and the emotional weight of it almost overwhelming. She had been an immortal for so long, had forgotten what it was to age, to feel vulnerable. But as the procedure came to an end, she felt a wave of clarity. When she opened her eyes again, she was no longer the young, indestructible warrior she had been. Her body felt different, less powerful, more fragile. Her heart beat with a familiar rhythm, one she hadn't felt in centuries. She could sense the passage of time again, and it was both terrifying and liberating. As she looked around at the other Immortals, now human once more, she saw the same mixture of emotions reflected in their faces. There was fear, yes, but there was also something more profound. Hope. Hope that they could now build a life beyond war, beyond immortality. The cycle of endless conflict had broken, and with it, a new chapter for humanity could begin. The Zorith, still unaware of the reversal, continued their campaigns, but now the tides were shifting. The humans no longer fought with an immortal army. They fought with something more potent, resolve. The war was still raging, but it was no longer the all-consuming force it had been. Now, the stakes were clearer. It was no longer about survival at any cost. It was about a future that was worth living for. Elysia, standing alongside Kale and the others, finally felt what she had not felt in centuries: alive. The air was thick with the tension of the battlefield, but there was a different kind of energy now. They weren't just fighting to survive anymore. They were fighting for something that transcended the war. They were fighting for a future where they could grow, where they could experience life in all its fleeting beauty. As Elysia watched the sky above, the weight of the stars no longer felt oppressive. It was as if the universe had opened up before them, offering the possibility of something better, something beyond the endless war. The question of whether they would win the war against the Zorith no longer seemed as important as the question of how they would live after it was over. "I don't know what comes next," Elysia said quietly, her gaze lingering on the horizon. "But whatever it is, we face it as humans." Kale stood beside her, his face weary but filled with a new understanding. "We'll face it together. And for the first time in a long time, that's enough." And with that, the Immortals, now mortals, prepared for the battles ahead, not with the certainty of eternal life, but with the hope of a future worth fighting for. The cycle had been broken, and humanity, at long last, had a chance to live.